The paper was smaller than she expected. Reese Calloway had pictured something official, maybe a folder, maybe a letterhead thick enough to match what it was about to do to her family. Instead, it was a single sheet, curling slightly at the corner, where her thumb had already pressed too hard. Elevated toxicity. Restricted use recommended. The words sat flat on the page, no urgency in the font, none in the spacing. Outside the kitchen window, the east field looked exactly like it had looked every spring of her life. Rows waiting to be planted. Soil the color it was supposed to be. Nothing about it announced what the lab had just confirmed. That gap was the part nobody talked about. Land could fail you and still look fine doing it. Her father hadn't come inside yet. He was still out at the fence line, arms crossed, staring at ground he'd worked since before she was born. Reese folded the paper once, then again, and put it in her back pocket, rather than leave it on the counter where he'd see it before she was ready to explain what she already planned to do about it. She already had an answer. She just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Not to him, not to anyone who'd remind her how long it had been since she'd actually run a field herself. Word travels faster in farm country than anywhere else Reese had lived, and it had clearly beaten her to the mailbox. By the time she walked the flag out to mark the sample site, 4 men were already parked along the fence, one of them filming. Dale Pruitt didn't bother lowering his voice. "Toxic ground," he said to the others, loud enough to carry. "Kid thinks she's gonna fix toxic ground with a bucket." Laughter followed, easy and unbothered. The kind of laughter that comes from people who've already decided how the story ends. Reese knelt anyway, gloves on, and began working the amendment into the first test row, while 4 grown men watched like it was the county fair. She didn't argue. Arguing would have meant explaining herself, and she wasn't ready to hand them that yet. Instead, she let the bucket speak. Dry gray powder, catching wind and settling into cracked soil that hadn't held a healthy root system in longer than anyone wanted to admit. Her back was to the fence when Dale called out one more time. "Won't grow nothing but rocks." She didn't turn around. She kept working, and something about the steadiness of her hands made the laughter behind her lose a little of its confidence, though nobody there would have said so out loud. What the fence line audience didn't know, what even Reese hadn't fully said aloud yet, was how little room there actually was to fail. The bank's renewal on the equipment line came due at the end of the season. That renewal depended on yield across every producing acre, including this section now sitting flagged and condemned on a county report. Gareth had been managing that number quietly for months, running projections at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, watching the margin get thinner every time he adjusted for the East Field's loss. 10 weeks. That was the window between the last frost date and the point where a corrective planting would still have time to mature before the community's fall harvest test, the same test that had decided reputations in this county for 3 generations. Reese laid out her plan that evening. Gareth listened without interrupting, which she'd learned over the years meant it was building an objection rather than considering agreement. "We don't have room to guess," he said finally. His voice wasn't angry. It was worse than angry. It was careful, the tone he used when he'd already decided something and didn't want to fight about it. "I'm not guessing," Reese said. He looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he was about to say, he didn't say it. He just nodded once and left the room, and the silence he left behind felt heavier than any argument would have. Here is the part of Reese's story the fence-line crowd didn't know, the part her own father had never fully asked about. She hadn't just worked an office job in the city for 6 years. She'd spent those years in agronomy, first in coursework, then in a soil remediation lab that specialized in exactly the kind of contamination sitting under the east field. She knew the chemistry behind mineral binding. She knew how older, undocumented remediation techniques, methods most modern extension offices had quietly abandoned in favor of standardized chemical treatments, could sometimes outperform the newer approach on ground with this specific profile. She hadn't told anyone, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but out of something closer to self-protection. Coming home already meant admitting the city hadn't worked out the way she'd planned. Coming home and announcing herself as the expert who was going to fix what generations of local farmers couldn't felt like inviting a second failure on top of the first. So she'd let them assume she was just Gareth's daughter, home to help out, following instructions rather than writing them. That silence had cost her something at the fence line. It had let Dale's mockery land without resistance. But it had also given her room to work, without an audience, second-guessing every choice. And for now, she decided that trade was worth making. The method itself had a name in the old literature, though Reese didn't bother explaining it to anyone yet. What mattered was the process, binding the mobile contaminants into a stable, mineral lattice the soil could hold without, releasing them back into the root zone using a mixture calibrated to this specific ground's pH and clay content. Getting the ratio right meant 3 days of testing before a single application went into open field. Too little binding agent and the contaminants would stay mobile. Too much and she'd choke out the microbial life the field needed to recover at all. She worked the mixture into 6 test rows at dawn. Before the fence line audience woke up, moisture levels tracked twice daily. Small variations in color and texture logged by hand in a notebook that had nothing hidden in it. Nothing dramatic, just numbers. By the 4th day, there was a visible change along the treated rows, a slight darkening, a texture shift that meant something to her even if it would have meant nothing to Dale. Then the sky changed color on the horizon, and the forecast, she checked that evening, confirmed what the clouds already suggested. A storm was coming, earlier and heavier than the season usually brought, and everything she'd just started was about to be tested by something she had no control over at all. Rain should have been good news for a field this dry. Instead, it was the worst possible timing. The binding agent needed 48 hours of dry contact time to lock into the soil structure before heavy water could move through it. The storm arrived at hour 31. Reese stood at the edge of the field in the downpour, watching runoff cut new channels through ground that hadn't finished, absorbing what she'd worked into it. There was nothing to do but wait it out, and waiting felt like watching something slip through her hands in real time. 3 days later, once the ground had dried enough to sample again, she pulled a reading from the treated rows and stared at a number that told her nothing had changed. No improvement. Possibly worse than before she'd started. She sat with that number longer than she wanted to admit. Every voice at the fence line replayed itself in her head, Dale's laugh loudest of all, and for the first time since the lab report arrived, she let herself consider that maybe they'd been right and she'd been the only one too stubborn to see it. She didn't tell Gareth yet. She wanted one more test before she had to explain a failure. She didn't fully understand herself. The second sample came back the same as the first, and Reese almost stopped there. Almost. What made her run a third test wasn't confidence. It was a small, nagging detail from her lab years, a habit of double-checking sample depth before trusting a flat result. Standard protocol called for testing the top 6 inches of soil. She pulled a second sample from 12 inches down instead, out of instinct more than plan. The number came back different. Not perfect, but moving the contaminant concentration lower at depth than it had been at the surface, which meant the binding process wasn't failing. It was working exactly where the rain had pushed the moisture, just not where the standard test was looking. She'd been reading the wrong layer of ground the entire time. Relief lasted about an hour before a new problem replaced it. If the surface reading had been misleading her, it might be misleading everyone else too, including whoever eventually came to verify the results officially. And word had already reached the county extension office that Calloway was running unauthorized treatment on condemned land. 2 days later, a truck she didn't recognize pulled up the drive, and a woman in a windbreaker stepped out, holding a testing kit that looked considerably more official than Reese's. Dr. Priya Anand didn't introduce herself with much warmth. She'd been sent to verify what was happening on flagged land, and her tone made clear she expected to find either nothing or trouble. "Standard protocol samples the top layer," she said, watching Reese pull a probe from 12 inches down instead. "That's not where we test. It's where the binding agent moved," Reese said. The storm pushed it deeper than a normal application would go. Anand's expression didn't change, but she took the 12-inch sample anyway, ran it through her own kit rather than trusting Reese's numbers, and said nothing while the reading processed. When it came back, her posture shifted slightly, the kind of shift that comes from a professional encountering a result they weren't prepared to explain. "This shouldn't be possible with a first-generation binding treatment," she said, mostly to herself. Reese explained the method, then fully, for the first time out loud to anyone outside her own head. Anand listened without interrupting, and by the end she wasn't taking notes to file a violation. She was taking notes because she wanted to understand exactly what she was looking at. Before she left, she asked one more question that changed the tone of everything. "Has anyone tested for secondary contaminants?" Upstream sites like this one rarely have just one source. Reese hadn't. Nobody had thought to. Anand's follow-up test came back 4 days later, and it complicated everything Reese thought she understood. There was a second contaminant in the soil, a heavy metal residue with a different chemical behavior than the one she'd been treating, one that the binding agent she'd used addressed only partially. It hadn't shown up on the original county report, which had only screened for the more common compound tied to processing runoff. This wasn't a setback she could absorb quietly. It meant recalibrating the entire treatment, sourcing a second binding compound, and doing it inside a 10-week window that had already burned nearly 3. It also meant asking a question she'd been avoiding since the day the first lab result came in. Where had this specific compound actually come from? The county records were incomplete on the old processing site upstream, but her father's records, the ones stored in a filing cabinet in the equipment shed rather than any county office, were not. Reese found the receipts by accident, looking for old field maps to cross-reference soil history. 22 years earlier, during a drought that had nearly taken the farm entirely, Gareth had accepted a one-time disposal arrangement from a nearby processing operation, cash in exchange for allowing runoff drainage onto an unused section of the property. It had kept the farm solvent through a season that could have ended it. It had also introduced the exact compound now sitting in the soil Reese was trying to save. She confronted him with the receipts that evening, not in anger, more in the flat exhaustion of someone finally understanding a piece of the puzzle that had been missing the whole time. Gareth didn't deny it. He sat down heavily at the table and said the thing he'd apparently been carrying alone for over 2 decades. "I told myself it was a one-time thing. I told myself the ground would be fine." He looked up at her. "I didn't want you inheriting a mistake. I made trying to save the place you were going to inherit. That was the real reason for his resistance from the beginning. Not doubt in her ability. Guilt he'd never found a way to say out loud. If you've ever inherited a problem someone else created with good intentions, or watched someone you love carry a mistake in silence rather than ask for help, drop a comment and tell that story. Also subscribe. This kind of thing happens in more families than anyone admits out loud, and it helps to know you're not the only one carrying it. Gareth didn't ask for forgiveness that night, and Reese didn't offer it outright either. What passed between them instead was something more useful than an apology. He asked her what she needed to finish the job. Not what she thought she needed, not what he thought would work, but what she specifically, with her training and her read of this particular ground, actually needed to fix what his decision had started and her stubbornness had refused to walk away from. She told him. A second binding compound, faster application timeline, and one more thing she hadn't asked for yet. His name, publicly, standing behind the work instead of standing at a distance from it. That last part cost him more than money would have. Standing behind an unconventional method on land the whole county had already written off meant risking the reputation he'd spent 30 years building with lenders and neighbors alike. He agreed anyway. 2 days later, when Dale asked at the feed store what exactly Gareth thought he was doing letting his daughter play scientist on condemned ground, Gareth answered without hesitation, "She's not playing at anything. She's the most qualified person in this county to be doing it, and I should have said that from the start." The corrected treatment moved faster than the first, informed now by everything the failure had taught them. Reese sourced the second binding compound within 4 days, working with Errand rather than around her. The extension office quietly interested now, rather than skeptical. Application went in across the full flagged section this time, not just test rows timed against a weather window. Errand helped confirm using resources Reese didn't have access to on her own. Gareth worked alongside her for the first time since the project started, hands in the same soil, following instructions instead of questioning them. The remaining window was tight. 6 weeks of growing season left after the second application went in. Less time than the crop would typically need to fully mature, but enough if the binding held and the soil structure recovered the way the depth samples suggested it would. They watched daily. Moisture logs, color shifts, the same small notebook entries Reese had kept from the beginning, except now there were 2 sets of handwriting in it instead of one. Neither of them said much during those weeks. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said at the kitchen table. There was only the work and the waiting, and a field that was either going to prove something or wasn't. The county's fall harvest test drew a bigger crowd than usual that year, word having spread well past the original fence line audience. Dale was there. Errand was there, officially representing the extension office this time. Even the bank's loan officer showed up quietly at the edge of the group. Reese didn't say much as the test crew worked the flagged section, pulling samples, running yield calculations against a standard nobody expected condemned ground to meet, let alone approach. The numbers came back in stages. Soil toxicity levels, now within safe threshold. Root development, consistent with healthy, uncontaminated ground nearby. Yield weight, when it was finally read aloud, came in above the county's own baseline for the surrounding fields. Not just recovered, but outperforming ground that had never been contaminated at all. Nobody at the fence line laughed this time. For a few seconds nobody said anything at all. Then Dale, of all people, walked over to where Reese was standing and looked at the field for a long moment before he spoke. "I tried something like this 30 years back," he said quietly, just to her. "Failed bad enough I never told anyone what I'd tried. Figured it couldn't be done." "It could," Reese said. "It just needed the right ratio for this ground." He nodded slowly, and something in his face suggested he was recalculating more than just this one field. The east field looks different now, though not in a way a photograph could fully capture. It's not just that it's green again. It's that the ground holds moisture differently, structurally in a way Errand has started. documenting for the extension office to study on other flagged sites in the county. Dale tells the story at the feed store now, usually before anyone else can, framing it slightly differently each time, but always landing on the same detail, that the girl everyone laughed at turned out to be the only one in the county who'd actually studied this problem instead of just inheriting an opinion about it. Gareth doesn't talk about his role in causing the contamination much, but he doesn't hide from it either anymore. He mentions it plainly when it comes up, and Reese has noticed he defers to her on field decisions, now without being asked to. Reese herself hasn't decided if she's staying permanently, or if this was one chapter in a longer plan. What she has decided is that she's done hiding what she knows to make other people comfortable with what they don't. The field doesn't need her to explain herself to it. It just needed the right treatment, applied by someone willing to be doubted long enough to prove the doubt wrong. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, the ones about land, family, and second chances nobody saw coming, let us know in the comments what part hit hardest, and share it with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated isn't the same as being wrong.